Not just the colonial narrative, some of the other narratives of the early 20th century as well. Now, we have already noted during our discussion on the historiography that a large part of the historiography is heavily dependent on the colonial archive. The colonial state itself generated a huge amount of material during and immediately after the revolt to be able to figure out the factors which led to this major uprising. So district officials, for instance, were asked to prepare reports, district-wide reports, providing details of what had happened in these years in their specific district. So we have a huge amount of these sort of district-wise narratives of written by senior colonial officials, that's the senior most officials at the district level, and they usually provide a chronology of what happened, the events. They try to identify those who were involved in those events, or in the uprising, or in the rebellion. So at times it is possible to get names also, specific names, dates, places in these accounts. And these accounts, they are actually entitled narrative of the mutiny in such and such district. And apart from that, they obviously also have a detailed account of how the revolt was suppressed in their district. At times, these accounts, they also served an immediate purpose. And that purpose was to actually identify the key rebels in a particular area. So these accounts, they also contain specific information at times about what individuals had been doing, or at least they cast suspicion on certain individuals. So in the reign of terror which was let loose as the process of suppressing the revolt gathered momentum, and the brutality and violence that accompanied it meant that many people got targeted because there was suspicion. This also became an occasion actually for those living in those local inhabitants to settle personal scores. This is what happened in Kanpur. I'll be talking about a particular source which I've already made a reference to. That is the Diary of Nanak Chand, which is discussed in great detail in Essence Sense 1857 in an appendix which is there to the chapter on Kanpur. This is something that happened in Delhi also, as we shall see. And in many other places similarly. This became a way of settling personal scores or rivalries. So people would just sort of go and mention so and so, participated in the revolt or helped the rebels and so on, and they would immediately come under suspicion. For instance, we know that the poet Ghalib, who was in Delhi, he had an inquiry instituted into his actions, precisely because somebody seems to have complained about his sympathies with the royal family and his presence at the court, at Red Court, where he's supposed to have been in attendance on certain proceedings which were taking place. So there was a spy report which became part of the official record, and it caused him a great deal of effort to have that matter sorted out. So there were, similarly in many other places, these accounts actually, and a lot of these sources were used in these ways to identify or cast suspicion on those who might have sided with the rebels. If these performed the sort of opposite function also of identifying those who had been loyal. So in later years, many of those who were identified as having been loyal, they were rewarded in various ways, with positions, with offices, and so on. So these sources are themselves implicit in the whole process of the suppression of the rebels. And that makes these sources themselves sort of difficult and complex for the historian. The historian has to negotiate these sources very, very carefully. Of course, every source has to be evaluated and negotiated and used very carefully by historians. But these are some of the problems which these official accounts have. Nevertheless, they remain extremely valuable. I have spent discussing Rudrangshu Mukherjee's work, Awadh and Revolt, or before that, S.B. Chaudhry's work, or even Eric Stokes' work. They rely more, they're heavily dependent on the colonial archive. But there's a particular reading of the archive which then becomes important. The reading of the archive, the rebels are very much present in that archive. And therefore, it is possible by using those sources to uncover the activities of the rebel. It's possible, therefore, to piece together the story of what was happening. Tapti Roy's work on Bundelkhand, the title itself, Popular Uprising. She looks at what was happening at the grassroots level, but she relies heavily on the colonial archive. But the difference is that the questions that are being asked to that archive are very different from the questions which were being asked in the late 19th or early 20th century. So their concern is not so much what was the cause. Their concern is more the larger social, economic, political context, and also the information that is available in the archive, in the official archive, of what the rebels were doing. We've already noted how a large amount of the historiography, particularly in the colonial tradition, is actually focusing on what the colonial officials, what military officials, what the army, what the colonial state was doing. More or less ignoring what the rebels were doing, except occasionally. But these archives, this material can also be used to understand rebels were doing. And that has to be then the question which the historian is putting to the source. What does the source tell me about the rebels? So it is possible, as S.B. Chaudhry, as Eric Stokes, as Rudrangshu Mukherjee, as Tapti Roy have shown, that it's possible to then history. Now, once you're aware, once the historian is aware of these problems, or has attempted to work out a framework within which then the historian, he or she, looks at this material, it can be used to write a history of, or rather histories of the revolt in a very different kind of way, which is what has been happening in the latter half of the 20th century. Also, I think it's important to bear in mind that this archive is extremely valuable also. It's extremely valuable precisely because of its vastness and its fairly extensive nature in geographical terms. So a historian would be ill-advised to forget about this archive. In fact, a lot of the material that has been ignored earlier has been used in different ways in writings of the 1990s or the early 2000s. The material is there. For instance, when we discuss Punjab, we'll see how there are accounts of what was happening in Punjab which have been in the public domain for a long time. But historians have by and large chosen to ignore it. It's only in the 1980s, 1990s that historians like K.C. Yadav, who sadly passed away middle of last year, when he was preparing a new book on the trial of Bahadur Shah Zafar, he worked on the events in Punjab during 1857. And we'll be discussing his understanding in more detail when I come to the pan-Indian character of the revolt. But the point that I'm making over here, that a lot of what he did was based on material in the public domain, material which had already been known, which was known for a long time. This brings me to one further point, that apart from the official documentation, the archival material, and a lot of private papers also, because we also have now historians have access to private papers as well of many of the figures who are connected with the revolt, there are also a large number of publications, huge amount of memoirs, huge number of book compilations of correspondence, private letters, and so on, which were published in the latter half of the 19th century. You will remember one work which I've already referred to several times, the small book by Rees, R-E-E-S, which is his personal narrative of the siege of the Residency. I've already pointed out to you that this was published in 1858, became immensely circulated very, very widely, because there was so much interest that we generated about what happened inside. And this was an intelligently written eyewitness account, full of information. Now, I pointed out to you when we were discussing the historiography that this is often quoted as a history of what happened at Lucknow, and continues to be cited in that way, as if it is a historical work based on a scholarly study of what happened at Lucknow, which it is not. And one could in fact say that it's not, it doesn't even pretend to be that. It's just a personal narrative, as the title itself says. So, what the historian would find valuable in this book is his first-hand account of what happened. And that makes it a valuable primary source, not a history of the revolt. Similarly, there are a large number of other works which came out in 58, 59, 60. In fact, at one level, even that pamphlet published by Mallison in 1857, which I've already referred to and we've discussed at great length, the context in which it was published, and the politics of that publication. In a sense, that is also primary account. It gives you an idea about contemporary official colonial responses to the mutiny in the Bengal Army and how they were trying to make sense of what had happened. So it can't be treated as a historical account. It's more of a primary source, and a large number of the publications which came out in the late 50s, early 60s are more of the nature of primary sources, and that is how they have to be approached. And it's a rich collection. It's a very rich collection. If it is approached as these should be approached, namely as primary sources, which then need to be await the evaluation of the historian and the sort of critical sort of engagement with that source. But apart from the official archive, there are some other sources as well, which we need to talk about, which historians have begun using over the last 50 or 60 years, have engaged with, and have shown the possibility that some of these sources provide for an alternative understanding of the revolt. And here, before I come to some of the sort of textual sources, there are two or three sources which I would like to, or rather, two or three types of sources which I would like to refer to when we are talking about the possibilities of different kinds of history. So there is the what we might refer to as the archaeological record. That itself has its own significance. And as we shall see when we come to the concluding topic, which is on the politics of commemoration, some of the archaeological record survived precisely because the British, the colonial state, memorialized certain sites. We don't have to go very far. Of course, when I say we don't have to go very far, I'm mentally thinking that we are sort of in the university campus. When I say we don't have to go very far, I really am referring to location, our virtual location in the campus. And perhaps as some of you might know, I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but close to the university, on the ridge, there are still structures which have survived because the British, after 1857-58, they saw these structures as worth preserving because they were associated with the suppression of the revolt, or what the way the colonial sort of understanding of these structures was that these were sacred sites. Sacred because they were connected to the sacrifice, the heroism of the British in their attempt to suppress the rebels. So many of these structures have survived precisely because the British associated them with the sacredness of the site. The ridge itself became, in the colonial understanding, a sacred site. So some of the structures, because for several months, the Delhi Field Force was stationed on the ridge. So this was seen as a site which needed to be memorialized. The ridge actually became very important to colonial understanding of this geographical space that is designated, that we call Delhi. And we shall see how that had implications also for some of you who might have done my course on strategies of imperial control would remember the 1877 Darbar, the 1903 Darbar, all of them held at the foot of the ridge. And it's precisely because of the association of the ridge with the river that this area became so important. So this memorialization itself led to certain structures being preserved on the ridge, one of which, if some of you have been to the university campus, the main sort of administrative block, you might have seen it's just across, you can see it just across from the university lawns and the rose garden, the flagstaff. But there are a couple of other structures also scattered over the ridge which are associated with the reward. Similarly, the Kashmiri Gate became a memorial, so it was preserved as it was. The idea was to preserve it as it was. And then there was, I'll be speaking more on these things, on these structures and these buildings when we come to the topic on commemoration. Here I'm discussing the possibility of using these sites as sources for the study of 1857. So there is this archaeological record which has survived precisely because the British memorialized. If we go a little further from the Kashmiri Gate towards the Red Fort, on the way there is the structure which was the gate of the magazine. The magazine is an ammunition store. So that has a part in the story about Delhi, which I will be discussing later on, but the gates to that were, they survived and they were then memorialized. So that became itself a commemorative structure. But perhaps the most significant of such sites is the residency at Lucknow. The residency at Lucknow. We've been talking about the long siege of the residency. The residency itself, we've noted, was actually not one building, but it is a complex of offices, residences, godowns, barracks. So that entire complex was surrounded by the rebels, and till November, those who were inside the residency, they continued to be, there was this constant fighting taking place, gunfire that was being exchanged between the rebels and the and then in November it was evacuated. But as we know, Lucknow remained under the rebels till March 1858. So after 1858, the British then shot shortly afterwards, they decided to preserve the residency complex. I won't use the word residency because complex of buildings. To preserve the residency complex as it was when the British recaptured Lucknow. Nothing was altered. That was the idea. So it was a commemoration by ensuring that everything remained as it was when the British re-entered Lucknow. There are one or two other buildings also of a similar bulk, which was on the outskirts of the what was then the city, the Dilkusha Gardens, which still remains in the state that it was found when the British recaptured it. So there are a couple of other sites, but the residency is the main site. The residency is the main site. And it continues to be under the Archaeological Survey of India, and it still remains as it was. So this structure is a valuable archaeological record. Unfortunately, there was one important archaeological structure which was demolished, which was associated again with the ridge, which was the Bara Hindu Rao complex, which was then sort of demolished and rebuilt as is now a hospital. So nothing of that structure remains, but that was very important to the events of the revolt. But in the case of the Lucknow residency, it still remains as it was, or more or less as it was, when the British recaptured Lucknow. So, that provides a useful kind of source for the historian who's trying to understand the events of this revolt. So that kind of archaeological record. There's also another kind of archaeological record, which is what we might say the absence itself of that record tells us something. So we know, for instance, that after 1857, after Delhi was recaptured, a large part, almost 2/3 of the fort, the buildings inside the Red Fort, the Red Fort were demolished. So there's a vacancy also. I mean, that became vacant space, which gives us another kind of story of India, from an archaeological point of view. We'll return to some of these things in different contexts, but here I'm just sort of drawing attention to the possibilities of using the archaeological record, which can be interpreted in very different ways when we are looking at some of these sites. There is another kind of source, or rather type of source, which in recent years has begun receiving some scholarly attention and has in fact become subject to very rigorous study in the last two and a half decades, very rigorous study. And this is linked to the historiography on photography in India, the history of photography in India. So from around the middle of the 19th century, a visual archive is being created through photographs, and this is closely linked with the development of this new technology. So, late 18th, early 19th century, there were a large number of painters, artists, who produced landscapes, who produced illustrations of locations in India, sites, rivers, fairs, festivals, which already had a very big market in the West. But from around the middle of the 19th century, a new kind of visual representation became possible through photography. It did not immediately oust paintings. Paintings continued to be in a lot of demand. There were painters visiting various locations who contributed also to the notion of the exotic East. So a lot of what was produced was supposed to be exotic, unfamiliar, and hence of value to an audience which was interested in, which was curious about these societies which were so sort of distant and unfamiliar to them, supposedly. So there's now a huge amount of scholarship on this, and I'm not getting into the details of that. I'm only over here confining myself to the visual archive which was made possible by developments in photography from the middle of the 19th century onwards. So the revolt actually coincided with these developments. And it is in this context that we have some of the earliest photographs of sites associated with the revolt. Please note what the distinction I'm making. Sites associated with the revolt. What we don't have is actual photographs of military confrontations, of fighting. What we have is photographs of sites associated with the revolt. Lucknow, Kanpur, Delhi, Jhansi, and various other sites. So you have from 1858, 59 onwards photographs. But they are important because they actually pertain to their contemporary. They might not be depicting, they might not be sort of showing, capturing a moment of motion, actual fighting. What they capture is the desolation, destruction of major sites associated with the revolt. Now, in this context, one of the important figures who has been discussed, particularly in the work of an important sort of pioneer of historiography and photography, so Penny actually has discussed the work of one particular photographer, early photographer, who produced several photographs of sites associated with the revolt. This is a photographer by the name of Phyllis Beato. B-E-A-T-O. Beato. So, Phyllis Beato, sometimes spelled as Felix Beato, F-E-L-I-X. Beato was a commercial photographer. And he is an important figure in the history of photography in the context of India. So in the Beato was Italian-British. He was of Italian origin, but British subject. And he began working as a commercial photographer. Remember, photography is still, particularly for commercial purposes, and in its infancy in the 40s and early 50s. So he is among the earliest commercial photographers working in Britain. And in the early 1850s, at the time of the Crimean War, he traveled to Turkey, and that's where he produced some of his earliest work. So he, in fact, began to focus on a lot of war photography. When the revolt broke out in India, he decided to travel to India and to produce photographs of which were sort of related to the revolt in India. Of course, his audience is ultimately a British or a Western audience for which he's producing this work. So he perhaps reached Calcutta sometime in early 1858 and then traveled to Lucknow. So he was there as he was sort of on the spot as the final operations of March 1858 were taking place. And he perhaps traveled along with the column, which was led by Colin Campbell, for the final sort of assault on Lucknow, final sort of military operations, which took place, as I've already pointed out to you, in March 1858. In fact, there is Binney actually refers to a later letter where there is a reference to this photographer who was accompanying the column which was marching towards Lucknow. And in fact, there's something else which this letter says, which I'll just come to in a moment. Now, what kind of photographs do we then get? The photographs we get are actually photographs which depict the desolation of the city of Lucknow. The desolation. There are no people. There are no people. There are buildings. There are structures. Structures which came to be well known because of the accounts which had already reached the British audience. So what Binney was providing was a kind of representation of buildings which they already knew about. That's what he was recording. And this desolation itself speaks of the enormous violence with which everything was destroyed. Not in the sense that every building was destroyed, but the city, as an urban space, was destroyed. So that is the desolation. That is the loneliness. Khamoshi, शहर की खामोशी, that is being depicted. So many of the buildings that he's depicting are buildings which are associated with the final campaigns, which people knew about. And one such building, which has been discussed by various scholars, Binet discussed it, then there have been others subsequently who sort of interpreted this also in slightly different ways. This is a very well-known photograph, much discussed in recent scholarly writings on photography and Beato. The photograph of, the picture of Sikandar Bagh. Sikandar Bagh was a building located in, as the name itself suggests, large private garden. And there were several such gardens actually on the outskirts of Lucknow, belonging to the aristocracy. And these structures were actually the British Army as encampments and for making preparations for the sort of final operations to recapture the city and recapture the presidency. So one such location was the Sikandar Bagh, which had figured in an earlier operation. Please note that, not in March, it had figured in an earlier operation in November 1857, when the residency was evacuated. So there was a military evacuation. So there was one operation before that also, when the relieving force had got trapped in the residency. Then there was another which took place in November, which led to the military evacuation of the residency, and then came the final sort of operations of March for the recapture of the city. So this building itself, Sikandar Bagh, or rather the structure in the Sikandar Bagh, had figured prominently in that earlier assault, in that earlier offensive of winter 1857. And there were heavy casualties on the side of the rebels. Heavy casualties. This involved very, very fierce fighting at Sikandar Bagh. Very fierce fighting, which led to very heavy casualties on the side of the rebels. Nearly 2,000 Sipahis were killed at this one spot alone. So Sikandar Bagh was already, accounts of Sikandar Bagh circulated. People were familiar with what had happened, and at least some of them were familiar. And this became sort of symbolic of the relief, as it is usually portrayed in colonial historiography. It's often referred to as the relief of Lucknow. So there was this earlier operation of winter 1857, and leading to heavy casualties. And what Beato did was to produce what has been referred to by Binet as a staged photograph. The photograph is that of a structure, the front of a building with a courtyard, and in the courtyard what can be seen are a large number of bodies of presumably the rebels. And there's been a lot of discussion about how such a large number of bodies were located in that courtyard several months after the actual operation had taken place. And the consensus now seems to be that in staging this photograph, the story is rather sort of horrible. The Beato had bodies which had been buried close by, dug up and placed over there. And that is what produces the terrifying aspect of this photograph. It's a well-known photograph. If you do a Google search, you'll immediately get it. That's the terrifying aspect of this photograph. So, these such staged photographs, in the absence of actually being able to capture the action, the fighting, in the absence of that, having such photographs became one of the ways in which the entire event was sensationalized for a British audience. Another example, which one could cite, is that of a photograph. Subsequently, Beat also came to Delhi, and there is a set of very important historical photographs of Delhi. He accompanied some of the troops, and some of them shifted to Delhi, so he enters Delhi, and he also has some extremely important photographs of Delhi, because these are the first photographs that we have of the demolition of the city after the revolt, after Delhi had been recaptured. So again, it shows a great deal of this desolation and open spaces which were created by demolishing large parts of the city. There's actually a volume which was photographs which was edited by Professor Narayani Gupta and Jim Massalos, Beato's photographs of Delhi, in which what they've done is it's kind of an album in which on one side you have the photograph taken by Beato, 58-59, and on the opposite page you have exactly from, or more or less from, the same point, a photograph which is recent. So it's possible then to place these together and see how things have changed. But it's a valuable album edited by Professor Narayani Gupta and Jim Massalos, Masselos. I think there's a copy in the department library. So in the case of Delhi, he went to certain other locations also, but there's this one photograph relating to Delhi which I want to refer to, which also has been discussed by Binney and some of the other scholars who sort of looked at it, both from the point of view of 57, but their interest is focused more on the development of this technology, and also in the way in which stage photographs, the kind of ways in which they were seeking to represent 57, 58, 59 to a largely British or Western audience, but also an Indian audience, because many of these photographs also became available to people in India. So this is a photograph of Humayun's tomb. Now, the relevance of Humayun's tomb to what the events of the revolt in Delhi is that as the city was being recaptured by the British, so their first assault is on the 14th of September, and by about the 20th, 21st of September, they have managed to bring a large part of the city under their control through, again, very fierce fighting. And just around the time that the city was recaptured, the family of Bahadur Shah and some of his retinue, they moved out of the Red Fort and shifted to Humayun's tomb and the locality, the area around Humayun's tomb, which also included the shrine of Hazrat Nizamuddin. So it's in that area that they sought refuge. And it is there that Bahadur Shah eventually was made captive by William Hodson, whose role I'll be talking about in a little more detail when we come to Delhi. And maybe some of you are familiar with the subsequent story. He was captured, brought back to the city, and after a couple of months was put on trial, after which he was sentenced to transportation for life and sent to Rangoon. So, in that story, Humayun's tomb became important as the location from where Bahadur Shah had been captured. And photograph of Humayun's tomb, but there is, again, it's vacant. There is an absence. There is obviously no Bahadur Shah over there. There is no William Hodson over there. That has to be provided by the imagination of the person who is looking at this photograph and is supposed to be familiar with the story and what this represents. So similarly, there are other locations also, like Kashmiri Gate itself. Again, the action is absent. So it has to be provided by the imagination of the viewer. The viewer's imagination is what provides the details. There is no action at Kashmiri Gate. There is no action at Humayun's tomb. There is no action at, I'll be speaking of one or two other sites like Kanpur. In fact, Kanpur, there's no structure also. Because there was hardly any structure actually. Just some barracks, which are also later on demolished. So, these are vacant spaces where the building, the sort of photograph of the building or a structure or the absence of structure is meant to stimulate the viewer to provide the details through the imagination. The viewer's imagination provides the details. So this then became a familiar way of depicting sites associated with the revolt. But they remain important because they are the earliest visual record as photographs, not as paintings, as photographs that we have of many of the important sites that were associated with the revolt. There's one other kind of source material which I think, just make quick reference to, which has been studied by an important scholar who's worked on maps and cartography, Susan Gold, G-O-L-E, Susan Gold. And she has drawn attention to one particular kind of source, which are the maps of locations, again associated with the revolt, with military sort of confrontations. And if you remember, when I was discussing J.A.B. Palmer's history of the outbreak at Meerut, we had noted that Palmer draws attention to the fact that actually there is no proper map relating to the cantonment or the city which dates to 1857 proper. There's a slightly earlier map which is, as I pointed out to you last time when I was discussing Palmer, which is an incomplete map of only a portion of the cantonment, and 1957, by which a lot of changes had taken place, and he sort of had to put together these 2 or 3 maps to be able to figure out the topography, the layout of the cantonment and the city. So Susan Bowles has actually pointed out that apart from this, there were several other maps. There were maps which were produced particularly for military purposes. So military purpose itself made it necessary that there should be some understanding of the layout, because that's extremely important to planning an offensive and for military purposes. So she notes that many of these are literally sort of maps drawn hastily on horseback. So you would have these military cartographers who would then be, or draftsmen who, those who draw these, sketch out the plan of a particular location. So they might be doing this through information that was provided through those who were part of the intelligence network, also making use of some of the older maps. In many cases, there were no maps available of certain locations or incomplete maps. So they had to work with these, but these became then a useful historical record later on for understanding the military the way in which things had worked in a particular campaign or fighting at a particular location. So that also remains a useful source. It's contemporary and it gives us an idea. Stories would be completely lost if they didn't have some of these maps or these drawings, which were produced hastily, almost instantly, from information gathered from various sources, and then based on perhaps in some cases older records, older maps, which were then sort of reworked for present purposes. So these are what I'm trying to draw your attention to is the different kinds of, it's not just the colonial archive. This, of course, is also part of the colonial archive mind, but it's a source of a very different kind. It has to be interpreted and studied in very different ways. Having sort of said something about these non-textual sources, let me, before I come to some of the archival material, refer to 2 other kinds of ways in which historians have worked with source material that is not the product of the colonial state. Not the product. There has been, in recent years, but even earlier, for some historians, some scholars work already, some interest in folklore, particularly folk songs, which recorded histories in ways which were important to the popular perception of the revolt, rebels, rebel leaders, and events. I will be referring you to one important article by Pankaj Rag on alternative sources, which goes into some of these issues. This was published in the special issue of Social Scientist 1998 and has been put together and published in a volume which was published in 2007. I'll be giving the reference and sending the reference here too. I still have to send you the reference for Eric, not the reference, I have to send you the PDF copy of Eric Stokes' book. I'll do that perhaps in a day or two. Now, so folklore, particularly folk songs, were an important way in which ordinary people were caught in the events of 1857 their sentiment. There's a very rich tradition, particularly in the context of Western Bihar, of folklore, of folk songs in Bhojpuri, which celebrate the heroism of the legendary Kunwar Singh. So Kunwar Singh is the great hero of these folk songs. These folk songs are actually a live memory. They're still sung close to this time of the year, near Holi. Particularly, there's a set of such songs which speaks of the main sort of sentiment expressed there is that women singing of Kunwar Singh, saying that, well, we will not celebrate Holi till the hero returns. So the martyrdom of Kunwar Singh, the heroism of Kunwar Singh, becomes the subject of a lot of these songs. So in this, there is an inversion which takes place. Unlike in colonial historiography, where the hero is the British soldier or officer, in this, it is Kunwar Singh and his followers who are engaged in a struggle for justice. So it's a just cause for which they are fighting and sacrificing their lives. So this became actually a very important source. In fact, after 1857, there were also, British ethnographers who collected some of these and published them, recorded them, published them. In fact, as I mentioned over here, that actually some of the songs were attributed, which were sung, as ballads, as which sort of became quite popular in parts of northern India, eastern India, central India. Many of them actually were attributed also to some of these heroes themselves. So there are songs, which are a lot of songs which were in circulation, the 60s, 70s, which are near contemporary. So they express, as I said, there are certain, there's some folklore which there is folk songs which continue to be sung down to the present day. So this is a live memory. But there were some which were earlier sort of popular, but kind of faded away. So there were attempts made in the late 19th century to collect some of this, record some of this, and in the 1970s, P.C. Joshi actually got down to the task of compiling a lot of these songs, translating them. So there's a small book which he published, which is edited by Folk Songs of 1857. Folk Songs of 1857. These are translations of songs. So I'll be sort of giving that reference also. So there's this kind of folk tradition, but there's another folk tradition which I must refer to, which has been used by historians in the past few decades to do a kind of ethnographical study. For instance, of shrines, popular shrines, local shrines associated with heroes of the revolt. One of the pioneers of this kind of study is Professor Badri Narayan, who undertook a study of some of the areas of eastern UP, western Bihar, at the local level, studied made a study of some of these shrines, these local shrines. So it might just be a stone under a tree, but which is worshipped as commemorating the heroism of rebels. In many cases, these rebels are just sort of referred to as Shaheed, or have no particular name associated with them. In some cases there are. But this is also important because this preserved a memory of the struggle of 1857 in the popular understanding of local pasts. Many of these actually are found precisely on those areas, precisely in those localities, in the countryside, in villages. So many of these are just village level shrines. So these are, but they are very often found actually precisely in those areas which were associated with very fierce fighting between the rebels and the British. For instance, there are some which he refers to, which are to be found actually in the areas lying between Kanpur and Lucknow. And we know the fierce fighting over in that particular, in that small stretch of about 80 kilometers between Kanpur and Lucknow. And one of the problems that the British had to face was the fierce resistance that they encountered from local villages, which made things even more difficult for them. So this was just to give you a broad overview of the kind of source material which scholars have been, which have been attracting the attention of scholars to be able to write histories of the revolt, which would question, which would undermine the histories, the colonial historiography and the colonial narrative of the revolt. Now, coming to some of the textual sources, let me begin by making a reference to a source which has received a lot of attention in the past 2 decades or so. And this is a series of documents, archival documents, known as the Mutiny Papers. Mutiny Papers. Now, the Mutiny Papers are a very specific sort of series of material, of records, which are there in the National Archives of India. And they are actually a part of the colonial archive. But these are documents of a kind which become important if you're sort of looking for alternative sources, because their origin is not the colonial state or its mechanism. Its origin. The Mutiny Papers are, this is to begin with, it's a fairly large collection of archival material. And this was archival material that the colonial state put together after they had recaptured Delhi. So they are mainly focused on the Sipahi regime, which lasted for about 4 months, from May to September 1857. So this archive, its origin was actually, to a great extent, the rebel regime itself. It was produced by the rebel regime. The documentation of the rebel regime. I'll have a lot to say about this when I come to Delhi, because this is an important source and there's been a lot of new sort of writing and discussion on this particular source. Here I'm just introducing this to you. I won't go into too much detail at this stage because we spend a fair amount of time on discussing the material that is to be found in this. But it's important to remember that these mutiny papers, they comprise the documentation of the colonial of the rebel regime. So there are diaries, there are orders, there are letters, various kinds of material, including what we might call the constitution of the Court of Administration, a remarkable document, which again I will be discussing when I come to Delhi, the topic of Delhi. So it's sort of, there are different categories, types of records within this documentation, which was the documentation, the police reports. So this is a large part of what is the mutiny paper, the archival material in the mutiny papers actually was documentation of the rebel regime. And it provides us with an opportunity then to understand how that regime worked. What its problems were, and it also gives us an opportunity to understand the ideas of the Sipahis about how they were replacing the authority of the English East India Company. So what is the kind of alternative vision that they had in mind? Did they have it? And if so, what was it? Or at least can we make some sense of it? But there's another category of documentation that you have in the, or archival material that you have in the mutiny papers, which are actually spy reports. So as the Delhi Field Force was stationed on the ridge from June onwards, the British built up an intelligence network also, an active intelligence network. And this network is what produced a lot of these spy reports. Some of these just small chits of paper. And meticulously sort of preserved by the colonial state. So a lot of this documentation also had to do with the intelligence network. And ultimately, these papers also served one more purpose. A lot of this was supposed to be the documentation for prosecuting Bahadur Shah at the so-called trial that took place in early 1858. And apart from that, as I said at the beginning of discussion, that a lot of this documentation also was intended to identify those who had sided with the rebels and those who had remained loyal to the British. So this is a very significant kind of archive, or rather a series of documents in the colonial archive. Most of it is not a product of the colonial state, but of the rebels. And the rebel sort of regime. its purposes, as spy reports, intelligence reports, or for identifying those who had sided with the rebels or those who had not sided with the rebels, those who had remained neutral, those who had been loyal, and of course for its, for being used, documentation for being used to prosecute Bahadur Shah and other members of the royal family. It had also a specific purpose, which means that this is also a selective archive. There's a specific purpose, or rather specific purposes for which it had been put together and compiled. So it's a selective archive also. And one has to be therefore careful that the colonial state itself is pursuing a particular agenda in compiling this documentation. Nevertheless, it remains important and under-researched. I shall come to other, more detailed discussion later. Here, I just want to introduce to you this series of records which are there. It's a very specific record. It's not general beauty. It's very specific series at the National Archives. In fact, if you go to the National Archives, you'll have to requisition separately a catalog for these beauty. They are part of a separate sort of series. As I said, they still remain under-researched, and a large part of it is unexplored. Then there are the newspapers which have survived from that time, mainly again from Delhi. Newspapers which were being published during these months between May and September. And they are also, and many of them have actually survived, and they remain important for understanding, the events occurring in Delhi during this period. There is an essay which I will be mentioning by Shiri Muswi titled Rebel Press in Delhi, which goes into a discussion on some of these newspapers which have survived from 1857. We just have no time for me to discuss one other source, again, which I'll be spending a lot of time on, that source. Perhaps next class or the class after that. This is a source which has now, of course, is now quite well known because scholars have paid attention to it. This is an account, this is a text that was produced in Marathi, written sometime around the 1880s, mid-1880s, and published first published in 1907 in a heavily edited edition. I'll be talking about the problems of the source also. Let me just introduce this to you. Time that we have in our class. It has come to be known as the title by the person who published it first is Maja Prabhas. It's in Marathi. It's a Marathi source. Maja Prabhas. Maja Prabhas literally means my travels, my journey. This was written by a priest from the of Vishnu Bhatt Barsaikar. Barsai was his village. Vishnu Bhatt had set out on a journey from his village in the Konkan region towards Mathura for a religious event, which I will be talking about. And he was a specialist in ritual and scripture. So, like some of the other priests residing in this area, in this region, his family received an invitation for this event, and he then set out on this journey, partly on foot, partly on bullock cart. Tells us also about, it's a great social document because it also tells us about contemporary how ordinary people traversed long distances, halting from one place to another. So he takes this long sort of circuitous route, crosses the Narmada, and close to Indore, as he's approaching Indore, he gets caught up in the events of 1857. He set out a little before that. The revolt had not yet broken out, and it's around when he reaches. He's accompanied by his uncle. When they reach the outskirts of Indore, that's when they first begin to hear of what has been happening. At least some things they begin to hear about as they approach Indore, or rather the cantonment of Mahu, M-H-O-W. So this is when they first hear about this, and as they move further, they begin to hear more and more about what's happening in central India, North India, and so on. Now, I'll go into the more details later on here. Let me just quickly mention this significance, one of the reasons why this is such a useful text. So Vishnu Bhatt, then gradually as he's moving northwards, he gradually also goes to Jhansi. And that's when Jhansi is besieged by the British forces commanded by Hugh Rose. And he's trapped in Jhansi during the siege. This is an extremely valuable source because he provides a great deal of information, or whatever information was accessible to him, about things that were happening in Jhansi when Jhansi was besieged. Remember, most of the colonial documentation and memoirs, letters that were published and so on is about what was happening outside. We don't have sufficient information about what was happening in Jhansi. And here is information that is provided by somebody who is not exactly part of the rebel forces or engaged in the sort of fighting. Is just an ordinary, what we might say, spectator, but a very careful observer of what's happening. A very careful observer. And his record becomes important because it sort of tells us about not just the days, that period during which the city was besieged. It tells us about what happened, the horrible massacre which took place after the British took over the city and entered the city and recaptured it. The violence, the killing that took place. He himself it was a miracle that his life, he didn't lose, he wasn't killed, so subsequently, of course, then subsequently his journey continues further north. Then, as the revolt is gradually coming to an end, he goes to certain other places as well, and then he comes back to his village, where in the 1880s, mind you, it's more than 20 years after he returned to his village, that he wrote down this account. We go into the possibilities over there, why he might have written it at all after after this gap. And then in the first decade of the 20th century, after his death, a few years after his death, he died in 1903, this was published. So that's the first time it came into the public domain, this source. Vishnu Bhatt Barsaikar's Maja Pravas. Now, I'll stop over here. I've just introduced this to you. I'll be discussing this in more detail when we meet in our next